Picture this. It's 1943, and you're standing in what looks like a complete American town. There are houses lined up in neat rows, thousands of them. There's a main street with shops, a post office, schools for the children, even a movie theater. The sidewalks are full of people going about their daily lives. But here's what makes your skin prickle with unease. Everyone living here knows something strange. They know this entire town, their home, is temporary. It's meant to be destroyed, not might be destroyed, will be destroyed. And they're not alone. Across America in the 1940s, millions of people were living in places exactly like this. Entire cities that appeared almost overnight. Cities designed from the very beginning to disappear. Why would anyone build a city meant to be torn down? And more unsettling, why would millions of Americans willingly move into them? The answer starts with something most of us know about the 1940s, World War II. But knowing there was a war doesn't quite explain why temporary cities became necessary. After all, wars had happened before. America had fought in World War I just decades earlier. But nothing like these temporary cities had appeared then. Something about this war was different. Here's the first piece. The scale of what America needed to build was unlike anything the country had ever attempted. When the war began, the U.S. military was small, almost insignificant compared to the massive forces already fighting in Europe and Asia. The country needed ships, planes, tanks, weapons, ammunition, and it needed them in quantities that seemed impossible. We're not talking about hundreds of planes. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. In 1939, American factories produced fewer than 6,000 aircraft total. By 1944, they were producing over 96,000 in a single year. So factories had to be built. Enormous factories. Factories that would dwarf anything that existed before. And here's where the problem emerges. The problem that would lead to those temporary cities. If you build a massive factory somewhere, you need workers. Thousands and thousands of workers. But where do those workers live? You might think the answer is simple. They live in nearby towns. But that's where the logic breaks down, and this is important to understand. These factories weren't being built in or near existing cities. They couldn't be. Many of them were enormous industrial complexes that needed specific things: access to waterways for shipping, proximity to raw materials, isolation for security reasons, or simply vast amounts of empty land. They were being built in places where almost nobody lived. Imagine you're the government, and you've just decided to build a shipyard in a remote coastal area where maybe a few hundred people live in scattered farms. This shipyard will employ 30,000 workers. Where do those 30,000 people sleep? Where do their families live? Where do their children go to school? The workers can't commute from hundreds of miles away. This is the 1940s. Most families don't even own cars, and those who do can't get much gasoline because it's rationed for the war effort. Even if they could commute, there aren't enough houses in nearby towns. And you can't wait for private developers to slowly build housing over several years. The factory needs workers now. The ships need to be built now. Soldiers are dying and waiting for equipment. This is how the temporary cities began. But here's what's strange. Calling them temporary almost seems wrong when you see what they actually were. Take Vanport, Oregon. In 1942, it didn't exist. The land was empty, just floodplains near Portland. Then the Kaiser shipyards needed workers, lots of workers. Within about a year, a complete city materialized. Not a camp, not barracks, a city. At its peak, Vanport housed over 40,000 people, making it the second largest city in Oregon. It had schools, fire stations, police, libraries, recreation centers, and a daycare center that could care for 800 children. It had a hospital. It had its own bus system. It even had a post office that handled 8,000 pieces of mail daily. And everyone knew it was temporary. But here's what makes this psychologically complex and why understanding this matters. These weren't prison camps. No one was forced to live there. People moved to these places voluntarily, by the millions. They packed up their lives and relocated to cities that were openly, explicitly temporary. Why would anyone do that? The simple answer is jobs. The war had ended the Great Depression almost overnight. After more than a decade of unemployment and poverty, Suddenly there were jobs everywhere, and they paid well. A shipyard worker could make more in a week than many people had earned in months during the Depression. For families who'd been struggling to survive, this was a chance they couldn't refuse. But that's only part of it, and not even the most interesting part. Something else was happening. Something about how humans relate to temporary spaces and why the temporary nature of these cities created unexpected effects. Think about how you'd feel living in a place you knew would be demolished. You might assume people would invest less, care less, form weaker bonds. But often the opposite happened. These temporary cities developed intense community life, precisely because everyone was in the same unusual situation together. They were all outsiders, all living in this strange in-between space. Traditional hierarchies that existed in established towns didn't apply here. Your neighbor wasn't someone whose family had lived on that street for generations and looked down on newcomers. Everyone was new. And there's something else, something that reveals how humans adapt to strange circumstances. People started forgetting these places were temporary. Not literally. They knew the cities were meant to be torn down, but they stopped living as if that mattered. They formed clubs, organized sports leagues, started newspapers, created traditions. In Willow Run, Michigan, a temporary city built around a bomber plant, residents created an entire civic life. They held elections. They fought over local issues. They argued about zoning and services as if the city would last forever. This is part of the puzzle. Humans seem almost unable to live in a purely temporary way, even when they know something is temporary. We nest, we build, we create meaning and routine. But it's not the whole puzzle yet. Because there's a darker undertone to this story, something that complicates the picture of patriotic workers voluntarily moving to temporary cities for good jobs. The reality included elements of desperation, exploitation, and a kind of social chaos that emerged in these places. The living conditions could be harsh. Yes, there were organized company towns like Vanport that had real infrastructure, but many of these temporary settlements were thrown together so quickly that they were barely habitable. Workers might arrive to find housing that wasn't finished. No heat, no hot water, mud everywhere because the streets weren't paved. Families might live in a single room with thin walls, hearing everything from the neighbors. In winter, these places could be freezing. In summer, stifling. And here's what the planners hadn't fully anticipated. When you suddenly concentrate tens of thousands of people in a new place with minimal infrastructure and no established social institutions, problems emerge. Crime increased. Overcrowding led to disease. Social services were overwhelmed. In some of these temporary cities, there weren't enough schools, so children went uneducated. There weren't enough police, so theft and violence increased. The bars were packed, and alcohol-fueled fights were common. Women faced particular challenges. Hundreds of thousands of women moved to these places to work in the factories. This was when Rosie the Riveter became an icon. But childcare was scarce. Some of the temporary cities built childcare centers, but not nearly enough. Women would work 8 or 10-hour shifts, then come home to children who'd been left with neighbors or older siblings, to housing with minimal cooking facilities, to laundry that had to be done by hand. The promise of good wages was real, but the life was exhausting. And yet people kept coming. The populations of these temporary cities kept growing. This is what we need to understand. The pull was powerful enough to overcome the hardships. But why? Part of it was that for many people, especially those from rural areas or from communities devastated by the Depression, even the harsh conditions in these temporary cities represented an improvement. If you'd been living in a sharecropper's shack in the rural South, a room in a crowded dormitory in a defense housing project might not seem so bad. You had electricity, you had running water, you had a steady paycheck. And there was something else, something less tangible but perhaps more powerful. These places represented change, possibility, a break from the past. Traditional American society in the 1940s was still highly stratified and segregated. Your options in life were often determined by where you were born, what your parents did, what color your skin was, what gender you were. But in these temporary cities, some of those old rules seemed to loosen, at least a little. Women were doing work that had been reserved for men. People from different backgrounds were working side by side. In some of these cities, though certainly not all, black workers found opportunities that would have been impossible in their hometowns. The temporary nature of these places meant old social structures didn't fully apply. It was a glimpse of a different kind of America. But before we make this sound too idealistic, we need to confront something uncomfortable. These temporary cities also showed how quickly Americans could be mobilized, moved, and organized when the government decided it was necessary. The same efficiency that built Vanport in a year would later be used for other purposes. The experience of rapidly constructing temporary cities and moving populations would inform Cold War planning. The idea that you could build settlements quickly, control where people lived, manage large populations in temporary spaces, this didn't disappear when the war ended. Now here's where the story takes a turn, where we start to see why these temporary cities matter beyond just being a curious historical footnote. What happened when the war ended? You might assume they were torn down immediately. The war's over, the factories close, everyone goes home, the temporary cities are demolished. Clean ending. But that's not what happened. When the war ended in 1945, something unexpected occurred. Many people didn't want to leave. These temporary cities had become their homes. People had built lives there. They had jobs, communities, friends. Their children were in schools. And more importantly, they had nowhere else to go. The small towns they'd left years earlier didn't have jobs for them anymore. The war economy had created a massive workforce, but the peacetime economy wasn't ready to absorb them. So these temporary cities that were supposed to be demolished stayed. Thousands of people continued living in housing that was literally falling apart in cities that had no legal permanent status, in a kind of limbo. Vanport, that second largest city in Oregon, continued operating for 3 more years after the war ended. People lived there, raised children there, in a city that officially didn't have a future. And then, in 1948, something happened that reveals a dark truth about temporary infrastructure. The Columbia River flooded. Vanport had been built on a floodplain. That's why the land was empty in the first place. Dikes were supposed to protect it. On May 30th, 1948, the dikes failed. Water rushed in. The entire city was destroyed in a single day. 15 people died. 18,000 people lost their homes. Here's the disturbing part. Vanport was temporary anyway. It was always meant to be demolished. But it wasn't demolished on any planned schedule. It was destroyed by a flood, and the people living there lost everything with almost no warning, because they were living in infrastructure that was never meant to last. This reveals something crucial about the concept of temporary cities. Temporary can mean disposable. When something is designated as temporary, it's easier to justify not maintaining it properly, not protecting it adequately, not caring as much if something goes wrong. But Vanport is just one example. What happened to all the other temporary cities? Here's where it gets complicated, and this complication tells us something about how America changed. Some were demolished as planned. Workers left, the buildings were torn down, and the land returned to its previous use. In some cases, almost no trace remains. You could visit the location now and not know tens of thousands of people once lived there. But others became permanent. This is fascinating. A significant number of these temporary cities never went away. The housing was supposed to last 5 years, maybe 10 at most. But people kept living in it. Local governments took over management. The temporary became permanent through sheer inertia and need. Drive through certain parts of American cities today, and you might be looking at former wartime temporary housing that's still in use 80 years later. It was never designed to last this long. The materials were cheap, the construction was rushed, but people needed places to live, and these places existed, so they stayed. This raises an uncomfortable question. How much of America's infrastructure is still temporary in this way? How many people are living in housing, working in buildings, using systems that were designed to be short-term solutions but became permanent because there was never enough will or money to replace them with something better? But we still haven't answered the deepest question. Why did this happen specifically in the 1940s? Why didn't America build permanent cities instead? The surface answer is time and resources. The country was in crisis. Soldiers needed equipment immediately. Building permanent infrastructure takes years. Building temporary infrastructure takes months. But there's a deeper answer, and it has to do with a fundamental change in how America thought about planning and control. Before World War II, American cities grew organically, slowly, through private development and market forces. The government didn't build entire cities. That wasn't how America worked. But the war forced a different approach. The government had to directly plan, fund, and construct massive amounts of infrastructure at unprecedented speed. It had to move populations, assign workers, control resources, coordinate across industries and regions. The temporary cities were partially a practical necessity, but they were also ideological. Building temporary cities meant the government wasn't permanently in the business of constructing and managing cities. It was an emergency measure. When the emergency ended, the government could step back, and normal market forces would resume. Except that didn't quite happen, because once you've demonstrated that centralized planning can build an entire city in a year, once you've shown that the government can successfully manage housing and infrastructure for hundreds of thousands of people, once you've proven that rapid, large-scale social engineering is possible, that capability doesn't disappear. Those skills, that knowledge, that precedent, it all remains. After World War II, America built the interstate highway system, created massive suburban developments, constructed huge public housing projects, planned urban renewal that demolished entire neighborhoods. The scale and ambition of these projects would have been unthinkable before the war. The temporary cities of the 1940s were a training ground for post-war America's transformation. But here's the unsettling part. The temporary cities were always understood to be temporary. Everyone knew they weren't meant to last. But the post-war projects, the highways, the suburbs, the urban renewal, those were supposed to be permanent. We're living with the results now, and we're discovering that some of what was built as permanent might have been equally short-sighted, equally driven by immediate crisis thinking rather than long-term planning. The highways that were supposed to solve traffic forever are crumbling and congested. The suburban developments that promised the American dream created sprawl and isolation. The public housing projects that were meant to provide decent homes became concentrated poverty. We built these things as permanent solutions, but we didn't think carefully enough about what permanent really meant. The temporary cities of the 1940s teach us something about this. Sometimes temporary infrastructure is honest. It admits it's not going to last. It doesn't pretend to solve everything forever. But permanent infrastructure can be dishonest. It promises to last, to solve problems, to create stability. But it's designed by people who can't actually see the future, can't predict how society will change, can't know what problems they're creating for later generations. Now let's return to the people, because the statistics and planning decisions obscure something important: the lived experience of those millions of Americans who made these temporary cities their homes. Imagine being a young woman from rural Mississippi who takes a train to California to work in an aircraft plant. You've never been more than 20 miles from where you were born. Now you're in a dormitory with women from Iowa, Texas, New York, women you never would have met otherwise. You're working on B-24 bombers, doing precision work that requires real skill. You're making more money than your father ever did. At night, you and the other women go to the recreation hall, listen to music, talk about the war, about the men you know who are overseas, about what you'll do when this is all over. The dormitory is temporary. The job is temporary. The whole situation is temporary. But right now, it's your life. And maybe, for the first time, you feel like you have some control over your life, some choices, some independence. Or imagine being a black family from the South, moving to a shipyard town in Oregon. The housing is segregated. Even in these new, supposedly modern temporary cities, racism is built into the structure. But there are jobs here that you couldn't get back home. There are wages that offer a chance at something better. Your children can go to school, even if the schools are overcrowded and understaffed. It's not equality, not by a long shot, but it's different from what you left behind. These temporary cities were laboratories, in a sense. They showed what was possible when you broke from traditional patterns, when you mixed populations that were usually kept separate, when you gave people opportunities they'd never had before. But they also showed how quickly inequality could reassert itself, how discrimination could be built into even brand new infrastructure, how temporary solutions could become permanent problems. There's a particular kind of photograph from these temporary cities that captures something essential. You see rows and rows of identical small houses or dormitories, all looking exactly the same, stretching to the horizon. It looks totalitarian, like something from a dystopian novel. But then you notice the details. Curtains in the windows, different for each house. A small garden someone planted in front of their identical unit. Children's toys in a yard, a handmade sign. People were making these temporary spaces their own, asserting their individuality against the sameness. And this reveals something about human nature. We resist being reduced to interchangeable units, even in circumstances designed to treat us that way. We create meaning and identity even in the most impersonal spaces. But there's tension here too. The temporary cities were efficient precisely because they treated people as interchangeable. Worker housing didn't need to be individualized. Workers were workers, and they needed shelter, full stop. This efficiency allowed the cities to be built quickly and cheaply, but it also meant treating people as resources to be managed rather than individuals with complex needs. This same tension would echo through post-war America. Suburban developments borrowed from the temporary cities' efficiency. Identical houses, mass production, standardized design. But unlike the temporary cities, suburbs promised permanence and individuality. You could own your home, customize it, make it yours, except that underneath, the standardization remained. The houses looked different on the surface, but they were still products of the same industrial standardized thinking. Let's talk about one specific temporary city in more detail, because the specifics reveal things that generalizations hide. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Oak Ridge was different from other temporary cities. It was built for the Manhattan Project, the secret program to develop the atomic bomb. In 1942, the site was rural farmland. The government seized the land, forced thousands of families to leave their homes, and built a city in complete secrecy. At its peak, Oak Ridge housed 75,000 people. It was the fifth largest city in Tennessee, but it didn't appear on any maps. It had its own water system, electrical grid, schools, hospitals, and bus system. It was surrounded by fences and guard towers. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Nobody could talk about what they did at work, not even to their spouses. Most workers had no idea what they were building. They operated machinery, performed calculations, followed procedures, but the larger purpose was hidden. They were making the atomic bomb, but they didn't know it. They just knew they lived in a strange, secret, temporary city, doing war work they weren't allowed to discuss. Here's what's important. Oak Ridge revealed what could happen when the temporary city concept was combined with total government control and secrecy. It showed that America could build a city, populate it with tens of thousands of people, keep it completely secret, and use it to accomplish something unprecedented, splitting the atom. And when the war ended and the bomb's existence was revealed, Oak Ridge didn't go away. It couldn't. The nuclear infrastructure was there, the expertise was there, and the Cold War was beginning. A temporary city built for a wartime emergency became a permanent installation for an indefinite new kind of conflict. This is the pattern we keep seeing. Temporary becomes permanent, not through planning, but through circumstance. Emergency measures become standard procedures. Short-term solutions become long-term infrastructure. Oak Ridge residents lived in that uncertainty for years. They'd moved to a temporary city for a temporary war, but the war ended and they were still there, still couldn't leave, still living in government-owned housing in a city that was now dedicated to nuclear weapons production. The fence was still there. The secrecy was still there. But now there was no end date. This captures something essential about the temporary cities. They created a kind of permanent impermanence, a state of suspended temporariness. People lived in ongoing uncertainty about the future, about how long things would last, about what came next. And maybe this is more relevant to contemporary life than we realize. How many people today live in similar uncertainty? How many Americans live in housing they can't afford long-term, in jobs that might be automated or outsourced, In cities they might be priced out of, in a climate that's becoming increasingly unstable. The specific circumstances are different, but the psychological state, living in a kind of permanent temporariness, is similar. The temporary cities of the 1940s were unusual because everyone consciously knew they were temporary. Today, many of our supposedly permanent arrangements have the same fragility, but we don't acknowledge it. We pretend our jobs are secure, our housing is stable, our infrastructure will last. Maybe the temporary cities were more honest. But let's consider another dimension: what these temporary cities meant for American identity and social change. Before World War II, America was a more static society in many ways. People tended to live where they were born. Communities were stable, sometimes for generations. Social roles were rigid. Who you were was largely determined by where you came from. The temporary cities disrupted this. Millions of people moved, often far from home, often to places completely unlike where they'd grown up. A farm girl from Oklahoma might end up in an aircraft plant in California. A black family from Alabama might end up in a shipyard in Oregon. A young man from a small town in Pennsylvania might end up in a munitions factory in Tennessee. These moves weren't tourism. These people were living in these new places, working there, raising families there. They were encountering people from different backgrounds, different regions, different ways of life, and this mixing, this disruption changed America. When the war ended, many people didn't go back to where they came from. They'd gotten used to different climates, different opportunities, different ways of living. The population shifts that started with the temporary cities continued after the war. The great migration of black Americans from the South to northern and western cities accelerated. Women who'd worked in factories didn't all go back to being housewives. Many kept working, kept the independence they'd gained. The temporary cities were a catalyst for social change, precisely because they were temporary. Because they were emergency measures, they could break normal rules. Women could do men's work. It was temporary for the war. Black workers could get better jobs. It was temporary for the war. Traditional hierarchies could be loosened. It was temporary for the war. Except that once people experienced these different possibilities, they didn't want to go back to the old ways. The temporary became a preview of the future. The civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, post-war mobility, all of these had roots in the disruptions of the 1940s, in the temporary cities and the social mixing they enabled. But here's the complexity. This same disruption was traumatic for many people. Being uprooted, moving to a strange place, living in uncertainty. This wasn't liberating for everyone. Some people hated it, felt lost, wanted nothing more than to return to the stability of the lives they'd known before. And some of the social mixing was forced. The government, in its urgency to build and staff these temporary cities, brought together people who had deep prejudices against each other. The result was sometimes violence, discrimination, intense social conflict. The temporary cities didn't solve racism or sexism. They just put these tensions in new settings. Oak Ridge, for example, was strictly segregated. Black workers lived in separate, inferior housing. They couldn't use the same facilities as white workers. The modern, efficient, scientifically advanced city that was building the atomic bomb was still reproducing the old Southern racism. Temporary didn't mean equal. So the story of the temporary cities is not a simple story of progress or liberation. It's a story of disruption, of crisis-forcing change, of people adapting to extraordinary circumstances in ways that were sometimes empowering and sometimes destructive. And maybe that's the real lesson. The temporary cities showed that American society could change rapidly, radically, when forced to. The structures that seemed permanent and unchangeable, gender roles, racial hierarchies, economic systems, regional identities, could be disrupted in months when there was sufficient pressure. But the temporary cities also showed that rapid change is chaotic and painful, that it creates winners and losers, that it doesn't necessarily lead to justice or equality. Change is not the same as progress. Now, as we try to understand why millions of Americans lived in cities meant to be destroyed, we can see the answer is layered. The surface answer: practical necessity. The war required massive industrial production. That required massive numbers of workers. Those workers needed housing. Building permanent cities would take too long, so temporary cities were the only option. The deeper answer, economic opportunity. For people emerging from the Depression, these temporary cities offered jobs, wages, a chance at a better life. The temporariness was a price they were willing to pay for economic security. The still deeper answer, social transformation. The temporary cities were spaces where normal rules didn't fully apply, where different possibilities could be glimpsed. They were laboratories for a different kind of America, even if that America was never fully realized. And the deepest answer, the temporary cities revealed something about modern life itself. They showed how quickly infrastructure can be built and destroyed, how rapidly populations can be moved and organized, how easily the seemingly permanent can become temporary and the temporary can become permanent. They showed that temporary and permanent are not absolute categories but human decisions, often driven by crisis rather than careful thought. They showed that people can adapt to extraordinary circumstances, but also that adaptation comes with costs, psychological, social, physical. The millions of Americans who lived in these temporary cities were not just responding to a unique historical moment. They were experiencing something that would become more common, life in a state of impermanence, in spaces that aren't quite stable, in situations that aren't quite secure. We look back at the temporary cities of the 1940s as a curiosity, as a strange artifact of wartime emergency. But maybe they were actually a preview of what was coming, a way of life where less and less feels permanent, where we're always adapting to new circumstances, where the future is uncertain and the past is increasingly distant. Those millions of Americans living in cities meant to be destroyed were not so different from us. They were trying to build lives in uncertain circumstances. They were making the best of temporary situations. They were hoping things would work out, that the instability wouldn't last, that something more permanent was coming. Some of those hopes were fulfilled. Some people used the opportunities in the temporary cities to build better lives, to access opportunities they never would have had otherwise, to change their circumstances permanently. But some hopes were disappointed. Some people ended up worse off, their lives disrupted without compensation, their temporary housing destroyed while they still needed it, their wartime opportunities evaporating in peacetime. And this is perhaps the final lesson of the temporary cities, that temporary arrangements can have permanent consequences, that crisis measures shape the future in ways we don't predict, that the line between emergency and normalcy is blurrier than we think. The temporary cities of the 1940s were meant to be destroyed. Many were, but their impact wasn't destroyed. The social changes they catalyzed, the planning methods they pioneered, the experience of impermanence they normalized, all of that remained, shaping America in ways that are still unfolding. We live in a world built by people who thought they were solving temporary problems. The temporary cities seemed like obvious responses to a clear emergency. But they set precedents, created expectations, demonstrated possibilities that went far beyond the immediate crisis. And maybe that's why the question of why millions of Americans lived in cities meant to be destroyed matters. Not because the answer is so strange, but because it's so familiar. We're all, in various ways, living in temporary arrangements that shape us more than we realize, building our lives in spaces that might not last, adapting to circumstances we didn't choose and can't control. The temporary cities are gone, mostly. But the questions they raise, about permanence and impermanence, about how we build our lives in uncertain times, about what happens when emergency measures become normal, those questions remain as urgent now as they were then.